Okay, so I want to remind you at this point why we're learning so much chemistry. Um, a lot of people don't understand how much chemistry is related to biology. So in grade 11, a lot of the topics that you guys would have learned were on a larger scale. So we looked at the human body and the different systems in the human body. We looked at plants on a whole. We talked a little bit about genetics, evolution. The biggest difference when you head into grade 12 is we're going to still learn about all of those topics, except the big thing is that we are zooming into a microscopic level and looking at all of these things that are happening at the molecular level. So we won't be able to understand any of the processes that we have to learn about in this course, and what's going inside of our body at that level unless we understand some of the basic chemistry that goes with it. So we've talked about bonds, we've talked about forces, now we're leading up to actual reactions. So reactions are needed to carry out the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. These are the two major, most important processes in all living things, which we're going to visit later on, and it's going to make up an entire chapter, or sorry, an entire unit. Right now, we just want to deal with types of reactions that we're going to encounter. So this is really more of just an introduction to what types of reactions are there, so that when we come back to them later in the course, you'll be able to make that connection. So all reactions can fit into one of two categories, and the first category being anabolic versus catabolic. So these are the two big main categories. Anabolic just means that we are taking small units of things and we're bringing them together to make a larger unit. An example is if we think of simple sugars in a carbohydrate. Simple sugars can come together, and when they bond, they form more complex sugars, which eventually, when they become large chains, we call them carbohydrates. So, for example, let's maybe add that in there. Simple sugars come together to form what we call carbohydrates. Okay, and then catabolic is basically just the opposite of that. We can take, and if we use the exact same example, we can take just the reverse of this. We ingest or eat carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates need to be broken down into simple sugars so that our body can absorb them into our digestive system. So carbohydrates are broken down into simple sugars. So now we're going to look at these in a little bit more detail, because there's a couple different ways these anabolic and catabolic reactions can happen. And so there's four main biochemical reactions. And the first reaction we're going to look at is called condensation. It's also known as dehydration synthesis, depending on what textbook you're looking at. But condensation reaction and dehydration synthesis mean the exact same thing. And I'll give you the ways to try and remember this. If you think of condensation, when condensation's forming, what's forming? Water. And if you're dehydrated, it means you're losing water. So if we think about a condensation reaction, so you don't need to know these structures and name the molecules we're looking at. We're actually just looking at the elements involved and what happens to those elements. So that's just focus on that. Don't worry so much about this. This is just a general alcohol because of its alcohol group. This is a general acid because it's carboxyl group. Okay? And when those two things come together in a reaction, it's a dehydration synthesis because what's happening is water is being pulled from both of these, from a combination of both of these. So one of them's going to give up a oxygen and a hydrogen, and the other's going to give up a hydrogen. And so that's where the word dehydration comes from as well. So condensation because water's formed, dehydration because water's being pulled out of something. And that's all you need to know for a condensation reaction. You see two molecules mixed together. Oxygen and hydrogen comes off one, hydrogen comes off another, and we get a water forming out of it. And what happens where those two were taken from each individual molecule, they're going to join a bond. So you're left with this oxygen by itself with now a bonding site, and you're left with this carbon by itself with a bonding site. So what happens is it forms a bond right here, and I will highlight where that bond forms. So here's the oxygen from this molecule came together with the carbon from that molecule. as a result of this water coming out. That's a condensation reaction. Okay, hydrolysis. It's the absolute opposite of condensation. So if we think about a catabolic reaction where larger units are broken down into smaller units, we're adding water in and breaking them down to smaller units. So if we go back to this example and we were to start here, these were our starting materials. Water's going to come in, break this bond apart. Hydrogen and oxygen will go on one, hydrogen will go on the other. So condensation reaction is the opposite of a hydrolysis reaction. Third, and there's 4 total, neutralization reaction. Hopefully you would have learned this in grade 10 and maybe revisit it in grade 11 biology, I'm not too sure. Neutralization has to do with acids and bases. So if we mix an acid with a base, they neutralize each other. And basically every single time, no matter what type of acid or what type of base you're mixing, these two products are always the same. So generally speaking, some sort of salt is formed and always water is formed when we have a neutralization reaction. And our 4th and final, this one's a little bit tricky. I'm just going to introduce it basically here. And because an entire unit that we deal with is going to go into a lot more detail on how this actually works. But we call this an oxidation reduction reaction, and also known as redox reactions. And it's involved in the process of energy conversion. Electrons are transferred between molecules. Okay, so all you need to really think about for this type of reaction, until we get some examples in one of our units we're going to deal with, is that we have 2 reactants. Those 2 reactants are going to mix together. One of those reactants will have an electron that it's going to give up to the other. So if we think about what's happening here, X has an electron to give. So over here it's lost it. And Y is who's going to gain it. Okay, so it's gaining its electron. And there's a funny little saying that I know I was taught when I was in grade 13 chemistry, and it still sticks around just to help you remember which is which, because out of the 2 reactants you start with, one of them is being oxidized, one of them is being reduced. So this is just a way to help you remember it. Leo the lion says grr. So a loss of an electron means oxidation. So X lost its electron, that's oxidation. And a gain of an electron means reduction. The Y gained an electron, so that was the reduction part of the reaction.